Thank you. Hi, everybody. I was getting a couple of errors while I was watching Zoe's presentation. I crashed out of the Zoom a couple of times saying my internet was unstable. I am running on a hotspot, but it seems to come back really fast. So we'll do what we can.
Let me say something too, because our host computer has kicked off and I can't get it back on. So there's something wonky going on with internet, I think all over the country right now, of course, right in the middle of School of Ice. If by some chance this computer shuts down, it'll end the meeting. Please sign back in and we'll hope it comes back on. This other one won't come back on. Bill is still signed in as a co-host and Layla, so hopefully we won't lose the meeting if I get knocked off. And Emily, if you do, come back in.
Yes, it seems to just automatically load back in. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to get too stressed. But
Good.
So anyway, here we are. My name is Emily Asenath Smith, and I don't actually get to do much work with Zoe very often. There is a little bit of work in here that she's been involved in because I mostly do lab-based experiments with ice. So I'm a materials engineer, and I very much think about ice as a material and studying the structure, property, processing relationships to better help inform what goes on, what folks discover in the field. So I'm just going to zip through a couple of slides to try to help you understand the contrast that my research brings into the CRREL environment. So I started out with a degree in chemistry, doing a lot of surface chemistry, and progressed into working on hybrid crystal lattice structures. So I've done a lot with crystallization, materials chemistry, these sorts of things, ultimately to pull together a bio-inspired dissertation where I was doing crystallization in sort of these low temperature aqueous-based systems that were completely based on non-biological materials. So I came to CRREL and people said, what are you going to do in an ice lab? I said, well, they're thinking about water resources. They're thinking about adhesion, surfaces, interfaces, composite materials, and even how could ice be an indigenous building material. And so from there, I pulled together sort of a research team where we essentially call ourselves the Advanced Materials Team, and we're looking at, really we're carrying out a lab-based experimentation program. We've started working more modeling into our tasks because there's certainly a good synergy there between modeling and experiment. But at the heart of the matter, I'm an experimentalist and I love getting in the lab and touching things and doing things. So I'm going to just show you a couple of slides about the instrumentation that we have. This is a contact angle goniometer. Some of you folks might have these at your school, at your departments. Really good for studying the surface wettability of surfaces. So what you see here is a water droplet, sort of the side profile of a water droplet sitting on a surface. And the angle, which is denoted by these purple lines, actually is an indication of the interfacial surface energy between the water droplet or the liquid droplet and the substrate that it's on. So you can actually probe a whole lot of information about surface chemistry just from putting a water droplet on it and making a bunch of measurements, tilting it and tracking those angles. So this has been a really great instrument. We've also done this at low temperatures. So we have a low temperature environmental chamber for it. So we can use water all the way down to 0, 1 degree Celsius, but then also we can look at other liquid solvents. And along the lines of looking at surface characteristics, this is a non-contact profilometer and nano indentation instrument. And the topographic image you're seeing on the right side of the slide is a surface scan that was taken with this instrument. So it's sort of showing you red is the higher elevation, blue is the lowest, and then we could cross-reference this or correlate this with a map taken of the hardness or the nano indentation of that surface. So we can then start to correlate mechanical properties to structure, and then of course doing other measurements on, for example, ice adhesion, pulling that all together. Thermal characterization is a big part of what we do. So the top center shows you a dilatometer, which measures the thermal expansion of materials. We do a lot with thermal conductivity and heat transport. We can do controlled freezing experiments with this teeny tiny optical stage in a microscope, or with the environmental chamber, where we can thermally cycle or carry out experiments with relative humidity control, which is really important. At this time of year, working with ice in the lab is really challenging because it's super humid and everything wants to frost up, and it's really difficult. So the research program that I carry out at CRREL kind of falls into two main bins. I'm really going to focus on the ice materials side here first by telling you a little bit about ice adhesion. So most everyone's probably experienced this, whether you were on an airplane in a warm climate or whether you were in the Northeast. Icing threatens the safety and success of operations across the globe. You can have communication towers glommed up with ice, or even collapsing from ice loads, causing interruptions there to both communication and utilities. Vehicles, often transportation is interrupted. And then also in the civil work side of what the Army Corps does, you can have issues with locks functioning. And what's really interesting is that even after decades of research and investments into coatings and surface treatments that would control ice accumulation, the military still uses manual removal methods. So these are our service members on a ship smashing ice off with mallets. Sometimes they use baseball bats, but there is always tools because at some point the ship takes on so much ice that it becomes critical to the stability of the boat, and they've got to do something about it. So we really we've come a long way in the materials world, but there's really a gap here between how we can make coatings and how we can actually transition them to the field. And so that's really where my research comes into this. So I want to tell you briefly, and I may be skipping some of this stuff a little briefly here to show you just sort of why the field of ice adhesion is a little bit disjointed. And so CRREL has a long history of testing ice adhesion. And it turns out that there's not actually any standard methods for testing ice adhesion. So you've probably heard of ASTM standards for, say, the compressive strength of concrete, or an ASTM standard for the tensile strength of a composite. Well, there is not one for ice adhesion. And so many years ago, CRREL developed a couple of very well-defined tests that they provide as a service to both small and large companies and other military organizations to help them assess materials and surface treatments. And so you can learn more at the website link that's listed here, but you'll see that through all these endeavors, we've worked with fabrics, polymeric thin films, various size configurations, standard coatings, advanced coatings. And so we really have been a go-to for trying to help folks in their R&D efforts for developing coatings. And because there's no standards out there, however, there's a lot of tests out in the field. And so this 0-degree cone test is the CRREL method that's been around for about 30 years. The peel ice adhesion test has been around at CRREL for about 15 years. And then out in the field, because of the applications to aviation, there's a lot of these spinning test stands, as well as test methods that are compatible with accreted ice. So the incident supercooled droplets. So those are all the ice types that you'd encounter in an aviation setting. And so the point is, again, there's no standard method, so there's many disparate configurations across the field. There's almost as many tests out there as there are people making coatings. I've really just showed you only a very few here. And so as a result, there's only the ability to make qualitative comparisons between coating materials. So that creates...
Emily, how big is these ice you're talking about?
Excellent question. So these are all really small. So this 0-degree cone test, this central pile is only 1 millimeter, 1 inch in diameter. These substrates here can be anywhere from 30 to 40 millimeters up to like 80 by 120 millimeters, so roughly 4 by 6 inches. These test stands are quite large, but the coupon, the sort of test area of interest is on the front of this leading edge over here, and it's really just a couple of inches in diameter. And these ice pieces on the post test are very small, so 1/2 centimeter or 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. So yeah, these are really small scale lab-based tests, and you can only make qualitative comparisons. So then the issue becomes, well, how do we take what we know from a laboratory test that was on a specimen that's, you know, 1 centimeter to 10 centimeters large? How do we translate that to the hull of a ship, for example? And so in order to do that, you want to better understand the type of ice that you're dealing with. And so there's a lot of different kinds of ice in the field. So like I mentioned before, the accretion or impact ice, it's relevant to the aviation industry. Here is this characteristic rime and scalloped ice that you'll find on the leading edge of an airfoil, formed by the high velocity impact of small supercooled droplets. So this is an airfoil that's in the NASA Icing wind tunnel. Freshwater ice is sort of slow growth from bulk water. It's kind of a static scenario. It's not impinging dynamic droplets. And that can have a very well-defined microstructure. And then for a third category, looking at saline spray ice, which is the low velocity impact of larger supercooled droplets, but now they contain saline or salts. And so with these, you get a spongy microstructure with entrapped liquid brine. And all three ice types have different microstructures and different ice adhesion properties. So here's a study from a group in Canada that showed sort of the difference in apparent ice adhesion strength, or the force that's required to remove these ices from the surfaces as a function of the type of ice. So having a consistent ice microstructure really matters if you're going to start to standardize testing. And so in my research group, we sort of took it all the way back to the ice, and we started working on how can we, first, let's have some very consistent ice growth with a consistent microstructure that's in a very regulated fashion so that we can actually form ice on surfaces and carry out these tests. And so inspired by some of the crystallization I've done in my past, we developed a Tucholsky-like method for growing ice on surfaces. And so essentially what happens is you have a liquid reservoir, and you're pulling through a temperature gradient, you're pulling a substrate out of that liquid reservoir, and it's causing the solid, the phase transition to solid to form. And so you essentially are drawing a solid out of a liquid. And so I'm really sorry that you couldn't come to CRREL for a tour, because we have this set up in one of the new cold boxes, and it's really cool to see this in action. But as a good second line of interaction, I've made a little time-lapse video for you here. And so what you'll see is, so this is our substrate of interest, and this is the liquid water reservoir, which is a double-walled beaker which has glycol running in the walls so that we can control the temperature of the reservoir. This plate up on the top is also thermally controlled so that we can now control the temperature gradient that we're going to be pulling this substrate through. So you'll see this substrate come down and just barely make contact with the top surface of the water through capillary forces, and then you'll see it slowly start to draw out from the substrate. And so there now we're forming this beautiful ice on the surface without touching it or manipulating it. And it turns out that we get these, I wish it would, we'll play it again so you can see the nice ice. I called it a laminate at the end. And these have beautiful regular microstructures that are columnar. And I will show you a little bit more about that right now. We have done a really thorough job of characterizing the thermal conditions that are necessary. I'm not going to dig too hard into that, but just to show you that our system's pretty versatile, so we can grow multiple different size substrates. We've actually even done larger ones since this came out. And if we continually add to the reservoir, we can just grow this mammoth, beautiful ice crystal. You see the ridges on it are from the intervals that we were adding ice manually, but if this became automated, we could increase the quality of that ice. So we get these beautiful columnar ice microstructures. And so what you have on the left side in these this tiled mosaic of green sort of pseudo-hexagonal grains, this is a thin section of ice in the plane of the substrate from which it was grown. And the colors that you see are because the ice is being viewed in transmission through cross polarizers. And the different colors indicate different crystallographic orientations of the grains themselves. In the section on the right, you see very elongated colored regions. And so essentially what you have are these sort of pseudo-hexagonal columns that are growing off the surface as we pull the ice out of the water reservoir. And so right now what we're working on is determining what the crystallographic orientation is of these grains. Tony Gao, who Zoe introduced you to, was able to show that this is exactly the same kind of microstructure that grows on the surface of still rivers and lakes. And depending on the conditions at the time of growth, you can have the C-axis of the ice lattice oriented along the length of the column, but you can also have other growth conditions where the C-axis is oriented horizontal to the growth, the long column of the grains. And so we're working on characterizing that so we can sort of better understand the structures. So just one little quick graphic here to show you. So there's a lot of folks out in the field of ice adhesion who just take a chunk of water and they throw it on a surface, or they put it in a mold and they throw it in a freezer, isothermally freeze it, and then take it back out of the freezer and remelt it onto their surface. And everyone looks at freshwater ice on a surface and says, oh, that's freezer ice. CRREL's making freezer ice. Well, I just wanted to show you the contrast between what is really freezer ice that's grown isothermally, has these highly disoriented, disaligned grains, as evidenced by all the different colors you see going in different directions. And it is certainly going to have a variable response when you apply a load to it to peel it from the ice. So once we figured out how we could grow ice really nicely, we're also playing around with, we can actually grow, depending on the conditions, we've been able to grow almost a single crystal of ice off the surface that are 30 by 40 millimeters. So we're tuning around with our growth system to sort of be able to map out the space that's available to us. So here's a couple of profilometry scans from polished aluminum and Teflon, some material properties tabulated in the table, and then a little schematic here that shows you the kind of testing we might do. So we'd take this coated coupon, grow the ice on it, and then the force is actually applied to the ice directly. So having a very well characterized microstructure is really important to the success of testing ice adhesion with in these studies. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm not giving you a ton of ice adhesion results. I wanted to really stick with the ice growth piece, but really ice adhesion is a super hot topic. We are growing ice, freshwater columnar ice on surfaces to enable us to do testing. Here is just a little snapshot of our testing configuration. This is the load head pushing the ice off, and you can actually see this little part here that's starting to delaminate as the load is increased on the ice front. And so along the lines of ice being a really hot topic, or ice adhesion, we're doing some basic research about how are these tests analyzed. We're looking at the analysis and the physics of that analysis to be able to translate what's found in the lab to, again, like something the size of a ship hull. How can we transition some of these technologies? And so I often tell people, hey, you know, I'm a material scientist and I work at in ice adhesion, and guess what? We're not making any coatings. And people are like, what, are you crazy? And it's like, no, actually, you know, I'm a civil servant and I work for the you know, the US Army, and our perspective is very different. And so we're looking at what's the fundamental science and the fundamental physics that we need to understand, not to make a great coating, but to transition some of the coatings that are out there. Because quite honestly, there's plenty of really good coatings out there. And so we're thinking about how antifreeze proteins that you might find in insects and plants and fish, how that also works with freezing. We're looking again, like I said, the effect of size and geometry, and also the ongoing expansion of alternative energy systems in cold climates is definitely requiring us to look more closely at how can we optimize the surfaces there to be able to have more time gathering alternative energy as opposed to downtime. So the second thing I want to tell you about is the effect of solutes and impurities in ice. And so we're often thinking about, right, out in nature, rarely is ice ever encountered as a pure single phase material. You have things like permafrost where even permafrost that have a high ice content are essentially contained in trapped soils and rocks. Sea ice has salts and extracellular polymeric substances, and glaciers contain silt and particulates. And so really understanding how these solutes and impurities affect ice properties is important for all sorts of things related to climate change, ice melting, but then also the Army navigating and moving over these frozen ground. So the microstructure is highly variable. We have here, I'm just showing you sort of the microstructure of sea ice. You get these elongated ice regions that are interspersed with brine inclusions of the salt water. This is a frozen soil sample that was taken with the micro CT by Zoe. And again, you just see a very heterogeneous mixture of different aggregates and void pockets where you'd have air, you might also have ice. Here's some natural lake ice from an old image that Tony Gao actually took, and you see these elongated grains that are characteristic of growing in a temperature gradient, and you see how he's denoted this C with a sub H. The C axis is horizontal to the length of this grain. So that's very, very unexpected, and it relates to the formation conditions. All totally relevant to the US Army and even municipalities having ice roads in northern latitudes and needing to navigate across them. And so what's currently out there for studying impurities in ice is really focused on frost heaving, and also, and then there's a whole nother group, and that's what's going on here, but there's a whole nother group that's looked at sort of icy satellites and interstellar ice. And then there's a large group of folks who've thought about reinforcing ice and making it stronger. And this sort of all derives back from the World War II Project Habakkuk effort, where they were looking at making an aircraft carrier out of frozen ice by reinforcing it with sawdust. And so largely that field has used some very heterogeneous materials to look at modifying ice properties. And so we wanted to better understand, okay, so if the Army encounters a frozen ice cover and it's not strong enough, how could we strengthen it? Or also, if we know that a frozen ice cover has some degree of impurities in it, how can we better understand the properties? So we wanted to carry out these studies and figure out the mechanisms by which particles strengthen ice. And we were faced with the reality that sawdust is highly variable in terms of shape and size, distribution of the particulates, even though it's just primarily composed of cellulose and lignins. For example, we all know that pine is a very light sort of, has a lot of resins in it, and whereas a wood like oak is much drier. And so I said, you know, how can we sort of idealize the sawdust particle to just sort of fundamentally look at the effect of particles in ice? So I chose silica particles because you can get them in these beautifully well-defined spheres, and you can also get them in well-defined rods. And so that's what we did. And then we looked at freezing these particles in ice and studying the strengthening, the effect of these particles of different shapes on the ice material properties and structure. So we'll start by first looking at the microstructure. So again, we've got some thin sections of ice that are formed in, that are being viewed in transmission and cross-polarized light. And the first column is just pure polycrystalline ice that you might make in the lab. So highly irregular grain orientations, a distribution of sizes. When you look in the middle panels, these are ice sections that were taken from samples that were made with spherical particles in them. So if you look at the little red, I lost my mouse again, there we go. If you look at the little red circle, you can see that there are ice, there are little spheres trapped in the center of single color regions, so they're within grains. And then you can also see the red arrow is highlighting these particles are at grain boundaries. And so the same is true of the rods. You can see that the rods get piled up at the boundaries, but they also show up in the middle of single phase regions. So we have like a pretty random heterogeneous mixture of these particles within the ice microstructure.
Can I ask you a question, Emily? So
Yes.
these silicate, you know, like diatom has a silicate. Basically, we use a lot with the diatom research that we do. These are not bio-origin, right? Just the regular as a mineral. That's what you're looking at?
Correct. Yeah, these are
right.
biological.
Okay.
So you can
Thank you.
You're very welcome. You can see the same type of structural features when we look in the scanning electron microscope. And so we've got silica spheres within grains and along boundaries. You see that also in the rod case. So the grain boundaries are these little lines that you see here. You can also see that in the rod case. We've got rods that are coming right out of single grain regions and that are also across along domains. If you look in this bottom right panel, you'll see that we also end up with some rods that span between two grains. So this boundary underwent a little bit more sublimation during imaging, so we were able to actually sort of look down in it to see bundles of fibers bridging across the boundaries as well as single ones. So the question then becomes, what's the three-dimensional distribution of particles within the ice? And that's where Zoe and the micro CT comes in. And so we did these, a whole bunch of scans of our specimens and then performed a three-dimensional reconstruction to get a rendition of a three-dimensional object that contains the ice, that ice contains our spherical particles. So you see that on the left, we have these spheres laced throughout the bulk of the ice. The ice is this sort of grayish matrix-like color. Air pockets would look totally black. Here we also have, then on the right-hand side, we have the rods, the silica rods in the microstructure of ice. And again, we don't get to see grain boundaries here, so it's sort of treating the ice as sort of a homogeneous medium. And there's a whole lot of really wonderful analysis that you can do with the data that you get from micro CT. One example is shown here. You could take the percent area that's occupied by the particles and map it out as a function of depth through the sample. So here's just one example, again, showing you that it's a pretty random distribution throughout the bulk of the ice.
Did you mix it before freezing?
Excuse me?
Homogenize the water, the silicate in the water before freezing?
To a certain extent, to the best that we can. We can't fully achieve a perfect distribution without adding surfactants or salts or other things that would then change the ice freezing point or microstructure itself. So this is somewhat random, although we do make efforts to sort of mechanically distribute the particles. So I want to point out that in the sphere case, you can see these perfect spheres with your eye. It makes sense. In the right-hand panel, I'm telling you these are rods, but they don't look like the rods that we've seen so far. And so I want to take a minute to sort of explain that because length scales are really, really important to material scientists. So if we have a voxel size, which is sort of the size of a three-dimensional pixel in the micro CT, it's on the order of 20 micrometers. The silica rods are on the order of 350 micrometers long, but they are only about 20 micrometers wide. And so essentially one silica rod is only one voxel wide. So what that means is that we can very easily miss part of it. And so it's only when you get these rods aggregated together that you might actually get a panel where you have adjacent voxels picking up a signal from the rod. And so you get left with these sort of truncated and irregularly shaped spider-like bundles. And that's a closer up view of that phenomenon. So it's a bummer, but I'd love to see individual rods, but it definitely, we still get some good information from carrying out these studies. So again, I'm going to glaze over this a little bit, but I just wanted to point out you can get some really great data from analyzing the micro CT experiments. Essentially, taking the data is one thing, and you can spend weeks analyzing it and getting out information about density, the degree of anisotropy, all these sorts of details, which are really powerful statistics. So we wanted to understand not just how do these different particles affect the microstructure, but how do they affect the properties? And so we took we have an in situ compression stage that we can use with the micro CT so that we can essentially put this little piece of ice, which you see here, between two platens and then compress the ice and hold it there while taking a micro CT image scan, compress further and hold it and take another scan so we can essentially get in situ deformation of the ice. And that is what we did here. So first of all, what you'll see is single phase ice. The ice this is the load displacement curve for the mechanical test. And you see that the single phase ice kind of goes up to a maximum, and here we go. And then it fails and the load drops off. The ice with silica spheres loads up and has some cracking along the way, but eventually approaches a bit of a maximum. The ice with silica rods, on the other case, is loaded, undergoes a tiny bit of cracking, but just continues to sustain a load all the way until we max out the load cell of our little in situ test frame. And so right in this trace here, the ice with silica rods is presenting as a stronger material or composite material than when we have silica, when we have sphere-shaped particles. And so what you see in what we did is made these three-dimensional reconstructions and then took two-dimensional slices through the bulk of the material so we could see these cracks forming and moving. And when the cracks first start to form, are highlighted by the red arrows, this is in the sphere case, they always form in the regions where there are no particles. And as you continue to load, these cracks enlarge, these black regions are the cracks, and they tear right through the center of the spherically, the bundles, the aggregates of spherically shaped particles. On the other hand, when we have these aggregates of rods, the cracks still form in the rod-free regions. However, when they start to propagate, they're actually interfered with by the bundles of cracks and bundles of rods. And so essentially what happens is the crack sort of bifurcates on the other side and has interrupted behavior. So essentially what we see is the cracks are impeded by the rods. Largely could be the case that it's because these rods are able to span between two adjacent grains, thereby sort of holding the structure together. And so with that, I'm going to summarize and about our project here. A nice little study we did just looking at the effect of the shape of particles in ice to find that to find some insight about the mechanism by which high aspect ratio particles can strengthen ice. And so there's a whole lot more research that goes on in the lab with my team, and specifically addressing advanced oxidation and water resources, and also heat transport and crystalline materials. We'll save that for next time. Just show you one quick snapshot of some new ice research that we're doing looking at solutes. So this is sort of soluble materials in ice using fluorescent imaging. You see that we get a fluorescent signal along the grain boundaries of the ice microstructure. And so this is pretty cool. It's really new stuff I just took last week in the lab. This is helping us to understand how the properties of solutes themselves are changed when they get entrapped in ice. So with that, I want to thank you guys for your time and for inviting me to talk with you. And just to say that we have a really enthusiastic team of folks here doing advanced materials research at CRREL. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you have.
Let's give Emily a round of applause. First of all, thank you so much. And we have time for probably 1 or 2 questions. And if you have other burning questions, you can email them to me and I can get them to Emily. Does anybody have a question?
I had a quick question brought up by Rosa's question about diatoms. And you may not know this, Emily, but I'm wondering if someone out there, because a couple people have mentioned diatoms, if they get frozen, incorporated into sea ice, because of course there are both more spherical or disc shape, and then also rod shaped diatoms with freshels of silica.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I don't know, actually, is really the real answer there. But what I do know from diatoms is that they settle out on the bottom of the sea floor. I don't think a lot of them have, I think they have a pretty quick settling time so that they're not going to be trapped in solution sort of up at the surface where the sea ice is forming. But if anybody's found a diatom in sea ice, please speak up. That sounds fascinating.
Just from the evidence from Antarctic sediment cores with ANDRIL, the diatoms are in open water and settle into the sediment cores, so they know it was a warmer time period. And I know they didn't find any sediment cores when there was ice covering the ocean. If there was evidence of ice covering it, there were no diatoms in the sediments at that point. I don't know much about it. I can ask that question of the scientist that does know, but that's what I know from seeing their evidence.
Yeah, because I do think there is some photosynthesis under at least thin ice cover. So that's, and the buoyancy, of course, when they're living, they regulate their buoyancy. So, and then the freshels fall out as they die.
It's a great question. I can ask David Harwood, who studies diatoms in the sediment cores, and he could probably tell us that for sure.
Well, let me know, Louise. That sounds really cool. I'd love to hear more about it.
Okay. Okay, Emily, thank you so much. I appreciate your time today. And wow, you do some amazing things. So thank you for being here.
Thank you all so much.